Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's meeting on the Ellicott City Circuit Courthouse reuse. My name is Zach Hollenbeck, and I am a project manager with the Department of Public Works. Thank you all for joining us. We're thrilled to see the robust turnout from the community. Tonight, we'll be discussing the potential reuse of the former Circuit Courthouse and surrounding county-owned parcels. I want to emphasize that no decisions have been made regarding the reuse of these properties. The meeting is intended to solicit community feedback, which will be considered as the county determines the most appropriate reuse strategy. As you all are all likely aware, the court functions relocated to the new Circuit Courthouse recently. Earlier this year, the Department of Public Works filed for a zoning map amendment for a change in zoning from HO, Historic Office, to HC, or Historic Commercial. This change will allow for the greatest number of potential uses for the parcels. The change was unanimously recommended by the county's planning board and is scheduled to be heard before the county's zoning board in September. That effort is proceeding in parallel to the potential reuse that we will be discussing tonight. Prior to tonight's meeting, the county issued a request for information to gauge market interest, to gain insight if the property should be addressed collectively or individually, and to explore potential ownership structures. The RFI responses and subsequent conversations were used solely for informational and planning purposes. Once again, no decisions regarding reuse have been made. Before we get started tonight, I'd like to review some logistics. The meeting will begin with a presentation, which will be followed by several polling questions. At that time, go ahead, go to the next slide for me, Greg.
For tonight's meeting, we'll be covering the topics that you see here on the agenda, with a little bit of introduction in addition to what Zach had just shared. We'll talk about the existing property, talk about the Ellicott City Watershed Master Plan relevancy, reuse opportunities for the site. Then, as Zach just shared, we'll talk about polling, address next steps, and then have Q&A. Next slide. So our team members tonight, in addition to Zach Hollenbeck from DPW, we have Shana Hernandez from the County Administration Office. We have myself, Tom McIlloway from Mahan Reichel, and Megan Oliver from Mahan Reichel. And we have Patty Restrepo from Chartwell Enterprises. And Chartwell Enterprises advises the county on real estate transactions. Next slide. So as a project overview, the Department of Public Works is leading this outreach effort for the planned reuse of the building and the site. And then this is in preparation for the potential issuance of an RFP, request for proposal, for the reuse of the site and the associated buildings. And this is per the Ellicott City Watershed Master Plan recommendations. In support of this effort, we have DPZ, Department of Planning and Zoning. They will be the technical reviewer in the zoning effort. And from DPZ tonight, we have Brian Schepter and Victoria Olivier, who are helping with the facilitation of this meeting. We also supporting this effort is Preservation Maryland. We have Nick Redding from Preservation Maryland, and he'll be talking a little bit later with a focus on the former detention center. Next slide. So the site is about 6.2 acres. You could see the areas highlighted in beige on the screen. The focus of this is the courthouse, the office building, the parking lot, which is known as the courthouse lot. And then also the former detention center is part of the property, but that would not be in the formal RFP process should it go to that point. Next slide. The county goals and intent. So the county's goals redevelop the courthouse campus. The redevelopment of the courthouse campus should really complement and enhance, but not compete with existing businesses on Main Street. This is very important, not to create that competition, but rather support Main Street. Any redevelopment and reuse will be historically appropriate and follow the Ellicott City Historic District guidelines. Reuse of the property should, whenever possible, emphasize clear visual and physical connections to Main Street and increase foot traffic to the historic district, and be sensitive to adjacent properties. At least some portion of the courthouse campus should be dedicated to a community use if possible. And then every effort should be made to leave adequate parking available for public use as part of the campus. And then lastly, create environmental site design practice. Creative environmental site design practices should be utilized whenever possible. And they might be green roofs, green walls, solar panels, etc. Next slide. The schedule for this effort. So as Zach had mentioned, there was a request for information, RFI, process that occurred during March and April, a planning board process that went from March into June. And then as part of that, there has been some community input that brings us today, the public meeting on July 20th. And we'll have a survey, an online survey, in addition to the polling on this question, and that'll be open for 2 weeks. And we'll talk a little more about that at the end of this meeting. September 1st is the zoning board hearing, and then should this move forward to a request for proposals or an RFP process, that would occur in the winter of 2021 and 2022. Next slide. And so we're going to review some of the existing property, the building, some of the interior, as well as the site. The next slide. So just for context, this is zoomed out a little more so you can see the courthouse lot, the courthouse, and the former detention center in context with historic Ellicott City, with the Patapsco Female Institute to the north, the Bernard Ford Heritage Center to the west, the Patapsco River to the right, and Main Street to the south. Next slide. The courthouse building itself is comprised of 4 principal structures with multiple floor levels. Over the years, these buildings serve many municipal functions, and there have been multiple renovations over the years. You see here the 1843 original courthouse, the 1938 addition. They were then attached to the 1842 Oak Lawn residence that became part of the county courthouse. And then in 1988 was the latest addition. That 1988 addition reoriented the courthouse building so that the main entry is now to the parking lot side rather than at the original courthouse toward Main Street. Next slide. Zach, do you want to share some of the interior shots?
Yes, thanks, Tom. So the interior of the courthouse, as it sits now, it's of course, as we mentioned earlier, been vacated. The historic courtroom number 1, which is the largest courthouse, generally remains in the same proportion that it did in its original construction. There are a number of smaller courtrooms, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, which are even smaller. And then the 1988 edition, which you see in the bottom left and middle bottom pictures, provided a long corridor to connect to multiple functions. The interior of the space is afforded multiple levels, as Tom mentioned, as you can see by the photo on the right, that are interconnected by a variety of different stair and elevator structures. Go ahead, Tom.
And then as we get to the exterior of the property, you can see several views here of the original courthouse, the 1988 addition, some of the open spaces associated with the courthouse building, and then also the oak lawn that faces Park Avenue. Next slide. And then the also part of this is the county-owned office building along Court Place. And then here are some images of the former detention center that Nick Redding will be talking about in a little bit. Next slide. There's an existing street network around the courthouse complex linking the parking lot with the courthouse building. Here you see a couple views of Court Place. Court Place goes through the courthouse parking lot and kind of loses its definition of a street at the parking lot. You can see adjacent to the courthouse and the office building, there's a very steep gradient along Court Place. And then we also have Park Avenue that skirts the east side of the courthouse building. It's a very nice, a very narrow scale to it. Both Court Place and Park Avenue have a very narrow scale to it, which really provides a lot of character of that street network. Next slide. We also have Courthouse Drive that extends along the northern part of the campus, and as you see on the slide to the left, it really loses its definition as it goes through the parking lot, and it just, with the exception of the yellow line, it has no definition as a street until it becomes Sarah Lane as it goes on up the hill to the Patapsco Female Institute. The parking lot is also divided into an upper and lower lot that you see in this image to the right. There's about maybe a 10 to 12 foot distance, a vertical distance between the two. Next slide. The relationship, it's important to consider how Mount Ida interfaces. This is actually the rear of Mount Ida, but it appeared, I think a lot of folks think of it as the front, and the access drive is off of Sarah's Lane, so this has starts to function as a front. But you can see how some of the planting and the electric charging stations kind of are in that view shed of Mount Ida. So that's something that should be taken into account with the reuse to create a more prominent view shed for Mount Ida. Next slide. And then as we go to the west towards the Howard County Government Complex, Courthouse Drive currently has no pedestrian or bike accommodations. We know they're planned as part of the Walk Howard and Bike Howard, and that comment has been brought up by others in the past that improving pedestrian and bike connection between this site and the courthouse complex is a great opportunity. Next slide. Views from the site are tremendous, as many of you know. These are some views from in front of the historic courthouse, looking out towards Main Street and Lot F. And then upper right is the view toward the Patapsco River Valley from Park Avenue. Next slide. And then we also have steep slopes associated with the property. The steep slopes that go from the parking lot up to the Patapsco Female Institute, the steep slopes along Park Avenue where we just showed that one view, and then of course the steep slopes at the courthouse steps where the implementation of the stormwater management in the courthouse steps shows a great example of how those steep slopes can be better utilized. Next slide. And then we'll need to be considering stormwater management at the site. These are some photographs of some of the low areas. Along the south edge of Courthouse Lot is a low area. Along the area adjacent to the Mount Ida property is low. And then, of course, the detention center sits much lower than the surrounding property. And perhaps that slope could be used for some terrace stormwater management, similar to the slope with the courthouse steps. And that's just something to think about. Next slide. View sheds, of course, the views that we talked about immediately from the courthouse building. We showed the photographs from Park Avenue and from the front courtyard spaces looking out towards Main Street. We want to be sensitive and need to be sensitive to the Patapsco Female Institute, the views from up there, from the hillside. And then also views as one approaches Mount Ida along Courthouse Drive. And then the views from the parking lot we have dashed in because they're right now, a lot of the views, you're not up high enough to really enjoy the views, but whatever happens with that parking lot may be able to take advantage of some of those broader views. Next slide. So, some of from our work on the master plan, and looking at the site from a planning perspective, we know there's some challenges. Adaptive reuse of the courthouse building is a challenge. It was designed as a courthouse and solely as a courthouse. It has a large footplate, interior bearing walls, and limited exterior windows. So that creates some challenges with what uses you put in the courthouse. Obviously, the topography between the property and Main Street presents some access issues. Vehicular and ADA accessible access options to the courthouse building are limited. The economic feasibility without an element of new construction is a challenge, and that's something that we heard from some of the RFI information that Zach, or process that Zach had referenced earlier. And then the public parking component in context of the broader Ellicott City parking resources and management. So we can't look at this parking in a vacuum. It really needs to be looked at holistically with all of Ellicott City. Next slide. So we want to talk a little bit about the relevancy of the Ellicott City Watershed Master Plan. You could go to the next slide, Greg. So for those of you involved in the process or familiar with the plan, we had, in addition to geographic frameworks that talked about things like the courthouse specifically, we also had topic area frameworks that dealt with community character and placemaking, flood mitigation, environmental stewardship, economic development, and transportation and parking. And all of these frameworks interface with this courthouse reuse. There's some elements of each of these, whether it's the green cultural trail that weaves through the site, the stormwater management and how that fits into the overall stormwater strategy, environmental stewardship and ESD practices, the economic development and the reuse potential for the property, and then of course the parking lot, and then connectivity with bikes and pedestrians. So all of these interface with this property. Next slide. We also know from the retail market study that was done as part of the master plan that some uses that some potential uses for Ellicott City include accommodations, and whether that's a boutique hotel, self-catering inn, or some other specialty lodging, restaurants, both full and limited service, other food-related uses such as specialty grocers and food stores, and we know there's a specialty grocer on Main Street, and then additional uses, home furnishing, specialty shops, clothing, antique, and jewelry stores, and those are most likely would really be attracted to Main Street. They wouldn't really be appropriate for up at the courthouse property with its separation from Main Street. Next slide. And then this is just in addition to the overall topic-related frameworks, there are geographic frameworks, and you see here the courthouse area is one of seven geographic frameworks. And the courthouse area here, this shape encompasses more than just the courthouse property, because whatever happens in the courthouse property needs to take into consideration the adjacencies to it, such as the Patapsco-Fimo Institute, Mount Ida, and so forth. Next slide. And then a big recommendation or component of the Watershed Master Plan was the Green Cultural Trail, and that's an opportunity to create a kind of a multi-tiered pedestrian experience throughout Ellicott City. That in red along the roadways and Main Street for a much more kind of urban experience where you're engaging with storefronts and active uses. And then in the green areas, a series of trails and pathways. Some might be rustic footpaths through steep slopes and woods. Others might be paved sidewalks and trails, but linking the resources, the heritage and cultural resources and natural resources throughout the community. And you could see that a loop, there's an opportunity to create a loop system that connects the courthouse with some of these other, the Bernard Heritage Center, and then also the Patapsco-Fimo Institute and Main Street. Next slide. And then in the master plan, where we specifically talk about the courthouse area, the specific policy recommendation is to explore different options to dispose of the property with creative solutions for redevelopment that complement enhances Ellicott City's downtown and reinforces rather than competes with the economic importance of Main Street. And this is a kind of a repeat of what the county's goals for this effort are. And then the next slide, specific implementing actions are highlighted here. I'm not going to read through all of these, but dealing with a sensitive interface to adjacent properties, looking at a holistic master plan approach, creating an open space network that connects with other open spaces, view sheds, environmental site design, public art and interpretation, and then also looking at a brand identity for this area. Does this Courthouse Hill become a distinct area within Ellicott City with its own identity? Next slide. And this presentation would be posted online after this meeting. So if you wanted a chance to look at some of these in more detail, you'll have that opportunity. In the master plan, we also included some framework plans that just address some of the issues, and we'll be talking about more of that this evening with potential relationships, areas where stormwater makes the most sense. It's just highlighted by the number of H, critical street connections with the A, view sheds, relationship to Mount Ida, and then off to the right are examples of where stormwater might be incorporated into the parking lot, and then how, if there is new construction on the site, how that could be developed in different ways to either serve as a focal point or facilitate connections between the courthouse and the Patapsco Female Institute. Next slide. And then the master plan included illustrations. Again, I want to emphasize, as we did in the master plan, these are illustrative, showing conceptual ideas, but they're not prescribed recommendations for the site itself. But this was just showing some potential for the site to use in the process for spurring interest in the courthouse reuse. Next slide. So now we're going to get to some specific reuse opportunities for this, for the site itself. And we're really here tonight to hear from you in the polling and the Q&A to get your input on this as well. We go to the next slide. First, we're going to talk a little bit about the former detention center because it's integral to the site and the relationship to the parking lot and the former courthouse area. So just a little bit of background, the detention center was completed in 1851. It was used as a detention center into the early 1980s, and then it continued to have some use until recently. The interior has been substantially modified by several renovations. And it sits down in a stream valley, a drainage valley, and so it sits low, and it's surrounded on three sides by slopes and stone rubble walls, which really add to the character of the site itself and part of its own character. So I'm going to turn this over to Nick Redding right now, and he'll, on the next slide, talk a little more about the relationship of Preservation Maryland and their role in the detention center. Nick?
Yeah, this is Nick. Can everyone hear me? Or can you hear me, Tom, I guess?
A little quiet.
We hear you.
Oh, okay. Well, I can speak up a little bit. Right. So this is Nick Redding, the president and CEO of Preservation Maryland, and thrilled to be here as a part of this. We are moving forward with a partnership at this point with Howard County government to look at how this structure can be reused from a really preservation friendly and sensitive standpoint. And so we have applied for funding from the Maryland Department of Housing and Community Development with the support of Howard County government to secure funding that would support both the architecture, the engineering, the planning associated with reuse of this building, and identifying uses through community input and outreach, which we'll be doing, that meet with the needs that were just identified in this great presentation so far, but also identify ways in which we can reuse this building from a financially sustainable standpoint as well. So in whatever way that works out, we need to make sure that how it's programmed helps pay for the long-term upkeep and use of the structure. So that is the long-term goal, is sort of identifying that, working with the preservation community and the broader Ellicott City community in that process. And if a suitable and viable reuse plan is identified, we as an organization anticipate and are interested in being a long-term partner in that project. But the first part will be stabilization alongside really figuring out how to program this correctly and coming up with a use that fits with all of this, and also provides contemplative public space, which speaks to the long history of this site as well as the difficult history of this site, which is not only the site of incarceration for a very long time, but also the site of several rather infamous and prominent lynchings in Maryland history. So that's our piece of this, and hopefully the community will be hearing more. We are optimistic and hope we can secure that grant from the state, and when we do, and if we do, we will be sort of moving forward with our aspect of the project, and happy to answer any questions when we get to the Q&A part of this.
Hey, thank you, Nick. Next slide. So we're going to talk about some of the areas for consideration. Again, as a review, these are highlighted in tan. Next slide. And so the areas highlighted in blue here are the areas of potential change. And so when we talk about potential change, it's important to emphasize that doesn't necessarily mean significant change. For example, the areas that are in front of the historic courthouse and may have very minor change. It might just be improving the open spaces that are there, or improving the landscape or the paving or something like that. Whereas maybe the courthouse lot might have more moderate or even significant changes within the parking lot. So these are just all the areas that would be under consideration. So the next slide. And just for reference, these are two cross sections. You can see that the top section A runs east-west, and it goes through the upper and lower parking lots on the diagram to the right. And cross section B on the bottom goes from the Welcome Center on the left up to the Patapsco Female Institute. So you get to see the relative grade change between Main Street, the courthouse, and the Patapsco Female Institute. The dashed line represents a 40-foot height, which is the current height limit in the zoning district. Next slide. So some potential uses for the site, and this comes from both the master plan process and then input from the request for information. Includes accommodations, office, business incubator, mixed use, event and meeting space, cultural or civic uses, some food related uses such as a restaurant or a food hall or specialty provisions, a public parking component, and then public realm improvements such as improving the definition of the streets and the sidewalk and bike infrastructure through the site, and then some other potential uses. And would love to hear from you all tonight on that. The next slide. So we're going to talk about the reuse site components in these 5 different, as it relates to these 5 components: the courthouse itself, the office building, the open space or flex space, parking, and the parking lot redevelopment area. The next slide. So as we look at all of these over the next series of slides, they all take into account these assumptions outlined here. One, that the preservation of the historic portions of the courthouse building with the reuse. So the area that's blackened in, that's the original courthouse, the 1938 edition, and the Oak Lawn building. So we're making the assumption those would be preserved with the reuse. A defined street design for Courthouse Drive with pedestrian and bike accommodations. That's along the top, linking Sarah's Lane and moving east-west off to the county courthouse complex. That right now, as you saw from the photographs, there's no definition from the parking lot. We can assume with the redevelopment that would be defined more as a street connection. A defined extension of Court Place to Courthouse Drive with pedestrian and bike accommodation. And that's again, Court Place currently loses its definition as it goes through the parking lot. And this would be defining that a little further, that you see highlighted here with the green and the purple color. That alignment may change. We're showing it a direct connection. That seems to be the most logical, but there may be a creative solution that shows that connection in a different alignment. The other assumption is the courthouse and Oak Lawn front yards, the historic front of the courthouse, and the Park Avenue slope would remain as open space. They might be enhanced with planting or removing invasives and putting in more native material or improving the spaces there, but they would remain as open spaces. Stormwater management and the potential reduction in impervious surface will be incorporated. That's subject to the stormwater regulations for the watershed signed into law in 2019 by executive law. And then vehicular access is the current front of the courthouse. Since that's really the only area where there can be ADA accessibility and vehicular access, we would assume that would occur in the reuse of the property. The next slide. So if we look at the courthouse, one option is that the courthouse building is reused in its entirety as a destination use, mixed use, or other destination use, or without a destination focus, where it might be just an office use or something that's not going to be an attractor of people. It'd be a specific use for a specific user group. The key here is it would be used in its entirety. That includes the 1988 non-historic portion of the building. Next slide. Another option is that the historic portions are reused, but then the 1988 edition might have some selective editing. And we're showing in this slide that maybe there's a courtyard that's opened up in the middle of the building, whether it's in the middle or there's a side that's opened up or some wings are created in some other way. The idea is that perhaps the building might be more usable or more adaptive for another use if there's some of this selective editing. And that would really come out of the RFP processes if it goes to that point, looking for some creative solutions. Next slide. As we look at the office building, one option is that the office building is reused for either office or some other use. The existing building that you see highlighted in black. The next slide. Since that building really doesn't, contribute to very well to the character of the area, another option might be that building, the office building, is replaced with open space. Next slide. As we talk about open space and what we'll call flex space, maximizing one option is to maximize the open space that's adjacent to the east facade of the courthouse along Park Avenue. Right now, there's some reserve parking that was added in over the years. So one option is that reserve parking is removed and that becomes open space. And that might depend on whatever the use of the building is. There could be outdoor terrace space that takes advantage of those views over across Park Avenue, or something that supports the adjacent use in the 1988 portion of the building. The next slide. Another option for open space is that if a significant open space is introduced into the site, one logical area for that to occur would be on the portion of the parking lot closest to Mount Ida. So it'd be along the street connection, have some street public frontage, but then also serve as a forecourt to Mount Ida and help preserve a view corridor coming from Courthouse Drive. The next slide. Another option for that space is that could be a flex space, a flex open space, or flex parking, and that's a concept that we talked a lot about in the master plan. If you recall, for other parking lots, that there's some flexible use, and that was a concept that we talked about here for this property in the master plan as well. That it functions as parking lot most of the time, but it's designed so that it could also function as a gathering space or active amenity space other times during events or festivals, weekly for markets or something like that. If we go to the next slide, and that's in the foreground of this sketch, that's what we had illustrated in the, this concept was illustrated in the master plan of how that could be a parking lot, but designed a little more aesthetically pleasing so it could also function as an open space, a flexible open space. Next slide. So as we talk about the parking lot, we've combined these two components, parking and potential new construction, because they really go hand in hand with each other. The parking lot is the area where new construction would likely occur if there is any. And so this concept shows that a portion of the lower parking lot remains as surface parking, but then the western portion of the lower lot and the upper lot could be an area for new construction. And this would preserve most of the view shed from the Patapsco Female Institute looking down toward the courthouse. Next slide. Another option is that maybe there's a less of a component of new construction that's restricted only to the upper lot, and then the entire lower lot is remains as surface parking for parking. Next slide. Or flipping that as an option, that the upper lot remains surface parking and then new construction could occur on the lower lot. Next slide. And then the other area of parking, we talked earlier about the area in front of Park Avenue, in front of the 1988 addition. They're depending again on the use of the courthouse, that maybe we maintain those parking spaces off of Park Avenue to help that use function better with more direct access to the roadway. Next slide. So, so these components are much like everything in Ellicott City. Everything is interrelated, and these components would be related. So whatever approach to reuse is taken, there could be a combination of any elements. And so the examples we showed are just a few. They could be mix and matched. You could have combinations of what we showed, or a different combination than what we showed. But they're interrelated, and again, depends on the reuse of the buildings and then the relationships of those other uses to the buildings. The next slide. So this is just a summary of what we just highlighted with the courthouse, the opportunities for the courthouse reuse in its entirety as a destination use, or reuse with some selective editing of the 1988 edition, either with a destination use or without a destination focus. For either of those scenarios. The office building, reusing as an office building for office or some other use, or replacing that office building with open space. In terms of open and flex space, creating some public parking area adjacent to Mount Ida, or a flexible space, introducing a usable open space next to Mount Ida, and then maximizing the open space potential adjacent to the courthouse along Park Avenue. And then the parking and parking lot redevelopment, different combinations of a component of some public parking and new construction on the upper and lower lots in different combinations of those, as we showed in the scenario. So with this, I think if we go to the next slide, we're going to go to some polling.
My preference is that the courthouse be reused as and select one. A. Use with a destination focus that could provide opportunities for more people to engage with and experience the historic structure. Such focus may include mixed use, hotel, cafe, restaurant, civic, cultural use, or etc. Or B, use with a non-destination focus, such as office, business, incubator, or meeting space. And we are gonna try to reopen that because we got cut off on time there, if we can do that. Bear with us for a minute here. Thanks for your patience. We had a question earlier on number of attendees. So we've had 59 attendees tonight participating. So we're now ready to restart the polling. We're going to reopen the same question. Okay, so we should have it open again, and I'll read it a little quicker this time. My preference is that the courthouse be reused as A, use with a destination focus that could provide opportunities for more people to engage with or experience the historic structure. Such focus may include mixed use, hotel, cafe, restaurant, civic, cultural use, etc. B, use with a non-destination focus, such as office, business, incubator, or meeting space. So if you select A or B and then hit the submit button near the bottom right-hand portion of the polling, then we will get the results.
And Zach, I'm going to need to have you read all of those questions because my WebEx is not letting me
Sure thing. No problem.
close out of the box that's blocking that polling question. So I apologize.
Okay, and this poll has ended. Do we see the results?
Hold, please.
There we go. Excellent. So of the responses, we received 63 responses, and it looks like we have a overwhelming majority in favor of A, use with the destination focus. Let's go ahead and go to the next question, please. So our second question here. It is more important to have, and select one. A, open spaces that are usable, places of gathering, providing connections, and that could be green space, plaza space, or any combination. Or B, open spaces that are primarily green space, regardless of whether they are usable or not. So that could be a replanted area, reforested area, something like that. Okay, John, do we get responses? Excellent. Again, we have a overwhelming support for open spaces that are primarily usable. So let's move on to our next question, please. Our third polling question. I like the idea of providing some flexible space that could be designed for parking sometime and gatherings or activity other times. Select one. A, agree. B, disagree. Or C, I don't know. So for space that could be designed for parking sometime and gatherings or activities other times, that might be something like Tom was mentioning just a couple of minutes ago, a festival or a market space that serves as parking when not serving that function. Okay. Let's see what we got. So again, here for our question here on the idea of providing a flexible space, we're looking at, again, a overwhelming number of responses in support of the first choice, agree that the space should be multi-use. Let's go to our fourth polling question, please. Okay, our fourth polling question. The reuse program should include some component of public parking, and select one of the following choices. A, strongly agree. B, agree. C, neutral. D, disagree. Or E, strongly disagree. Again, does the reuse program, if we think about reusing the parking lot, how do we reuse it? Should we include some component of public parking? Strongly agree through strongly disagree. All righty. Well, looks like a majority and strongly agree, followed closely by a number of responses in the agree category, and a few neutrals. So leaning mostly towards strongly agree. Alrighty, let's go to our next polling question. Okay, our fifth polling question. I am most interested in or concerned about. Select one. A, getting the right uses for the building and site. B, getting the right design and site plans, regardless of the use. C, reducing impervious surface and providing stormwater management. D, preserving historic character. E, other. Or F, I don't know. So what are you, as a responder to this poll, most interested or concerned about? All right, so looking for our responses here. What am I most interested or concerned with? We have a slight majority in reducing impervious surface, followed by almost a tie for preserving historic character and getting the right uses, and then followed by getting the right design. Excellent. Okay, and our last polling question of the evening.
I believe that was it. There was 5.
Oh, that was it? I'm sorry.
Okay, Zach, thank you. I can pick up here. We can go into the next steps and then talk about the question and answer period. So if we go to the next slide. Excellent. So next steps. So just to reiterate from the schedule that we shared earlier, we're here on July 20th, the public meeting. We'll have a survey that will be available sometime tomorrow on the website, and it will be open until August 2nd, midnight, August 2nd. And then the survey has a lot more nuanced results. Again, the zoning, more nuanced answers or questions. September 1st is the zoning board hearing. And then if it goes to an RFP process, that'd be for anticipated the winter of 2021 and 22. Next slide. So again, the online survey to Monday, August 2nd till midnight. The meeting presentation that we shared tonight, the slides, and the survey, when the survey results are back in after August 2nd, they will be posted to the website that's identified below. The survey results, and then also the survey, the link to the survey will be on this website.
And Tom, we will also be emailing a link to the survey to all of the attendees tonight, as well as all of those members of the public who signed up for email notifications during the Ellicott City Watershed Master Plan process. Okay, we're ready for Q&A?
Yes.
Excellent. Alrighty, so our first question here, what interior historic features remain in the 1843 and 1838 portions of the building? So with regards to those portions of the building, the form and shape of the historic original courtroom, or courtroom 1 as it's known now, is still there. There are some wood casings, doors, other elements that you would suspect are certainly old. I'm not sure if they are original to the structure, but are certainly what would most likely be character defining elements of the building. Second question we have, what is the condition of its physical structure, and is it in danger of having roof leaks? So the physical structure, the exterior building envelope is not in danger of leaking right now. The Bureau of Facilities has maintained and will maintain into the future until such point as perhaps an RFP process transfers ownership. But we will, the Bureau of Facilities, be maintaining this structure for the foreseeable future. That includes regular walkthroughs to make sure that we don't have any leaks, and then addressing those if they were to come up or present themselves. The building envelope itself is in fair condition. Many of the windows are, as you would suspect, not energy efficient. Many of the doors, as you would suspect, not insulated. The roof and walls, have a large mass because they're granite, but certainly would not be developed as a building would be developed in current code considerations. Looking at our third question with a budget for third question here, is there a budget for this redevelopment? So the county is, as most of you are well aware, we're focused on implementing flood mitigation projects with available county, federal, and state funds that we have. And so we've been primarily focused on EC safe and sound flood mitigation projects. There's no budget that the county has established for the redevelopment process. The next question we have here, will this study consider the surrounding private property zoned HO that will be left after the courthouse is rezoned, potentially rezoned to HC? And so, we are, as DPW in the county, proposing a potential rezoning of our our property. So there won't be any direct rezoning of those surrounding properties. Any potential redevelopment or improvements in the county-owned properties that we're discussing tonight could potentially indirectly support other uses in surrounding parcels. And of course, the county can only tonight propose potential reuse of property that we own. Next question we got, does the courthouse have asbestos, and what is the condition of the roof? So the first part of that is, as can be suspected, as would be expected with a building of this vintage, there are a number of suspected hazardous materials within the courthouse. Some of them have been abated over the years. We maintain all of the necessary environmental controls that we need to make sure they're not in condition of deteriorating. But there would likely need to be some abatement done with a proposed renovation. What is the condition of the roof? So the roof is I'm not sure how old, but quite old copper roof. Copper roofs should last decades. And so we do, the vast majority of the building is copper. It does have some sections over the, I'll call it middle portion of the 1988 that are a membrane roof. We at the Bureau of Facilities maintain a robust program where we clean, assess, and make repairs to the roof. So the roof is in generally sound condition for the building of its age. Okay, our next question. What did the county receive from its request for potential interest in the area? So from the RFI process, we did receive a few responses to that. There was some, as you would imagine, some interest in the various parcels as well as the courthouse. There was interest in them collectively and potentially individually as separate. We did hear from a number of teams that this is a tremendous opportunity, and through the RFI process, that there are a number of interested teams who are very interested in this and looking to advance the goals and policies that were outlined in the master plan to develop potential reuse that's complementary and supports the existing strong community that we have along Main Street and its surrounding areas.
And Zach, if I can just mention one thing, just like what you mentioned, there was, of course, interest from the development community, from business owners on Main Street as users, and then also entities like you mentioned that have interest in preserving the historic or the history of that area and certain buildings like the former detention center.
Thank you, Patty. Next question we had here, has any consideration been given to using the courthouse for education, something like part of HCC or the University System of Maryland? So we're here to explore all potential uses, and we welcome any suggestions and any input that the community may have, including potential education use. We did receive during the RFI process some potential interest in having a gathering space that could be supporting multiple functions, such as education. All right, so we got a question here. Has or will the county include equity as a factor in the redevelopment, new business, housing that are affordable or a broad spectrum of residents, transit stops, open space that residents can enjoy at no cost? So I think all of those things are great ideas and ideas that we're hoping to extract from this process, from the community input of this process, and that all of those would be ideas that could potentially be utilized in the RFP if we go that way, or in potential reuses if there was no RFP. So we've received a few questions tonight about what the new construction could be. And so where we showed some orange blocks of potential new construction on the upper or lower parking lots. So with regards to that, we're open to exploring all potential ideas for what that could be. We don't have any preconceived notion. I mentioned several times in my opening remarks that the county has not made any decisions one way or the other. We're interested in hearing what the community would like, and we're interested to hear what may be proposed by developers through the RFP process.
Zach, just one thing to add with that is, and Tom already mentioned it, for the economic feasibility of this project, new construction is going to be an important element. So I just wanted to reiterate that right now, but Tom had mentioned that earlier in the presentation.
I think we have a question for Nick, if Nick's...
I'm happy to do that. I understand the question there about the Department of Housing and Community Development. Does that require housing? No, it's just the name of the state agency. The actual specific grant fund is likely, to confuse it even more, is called the Strategic Demolition and Growth Fund, and it will also not involve demolition. But it's a flexible funding source for revitalization of community resources across the state, and has been used. We're a recipient of funds of it. We're using it in a community in Hagerstown to invest in historic structures there. So two confusing titles, but no, it won't require housing, won't involve demolition, and is going to be entirely focused on appropriate planning, community input, and likely some stabilization activities as well.
Yeah, just to build on that, the county has secured DHCD grants for a number of other initiatives within Ellicott City. We had some community legacy funds from the Department of Housing and Community Development that we used to restore some facades on Main Street and stabilize other buildings. So, just because the money comes from the Department of Housing and Community Development, as Nick mentioned, it doesn't imply that we have to include a housing component in the project. So we got a question that says, is it true that to say that flood mitigation will be paid for and completed before these projects move forward? Well, we're working to advance flood mitigation as fast as possible. We don't know the exact timelines of all of those projects because a number of the necessary steps are based on regulatory approval that are outside of our control, but we're working with all of those regulatory agencies to advance all of the flood mitigation projects as quickly as possible. All right. So we got a question of how much of the current building is non-ADA accessible. I think it would be fair to say that ADA accessibility in the current building is challenging. There are a number of provisions that have been made within the existing building to include ADA access to areas that wouldn't otherwise be naturally ADA accessible, including stair lifts and small lifts and ramps and stuff like that. So the way that the building was utilized recently was that every space that was required to have ADA accessibility was either ADA accessible or there was a comparable space to incorporate that function into it. Seems like we got a question here for Patty, which I'll read. Why is new construction considered an essential requirement for the redevelopment to succeed? It's not a prerequisite, but redevelopment of the courthouse would be challenging without an element of new construction.
Mm-hmm. And it goes back to the economic feasibility of the entire project. Tom had mentioned with the courthouse, it does have a historic nature to it. And so there are challenges with redeveloping the courthouse. So with what developers will do is they'll say, okay, let's look at it holistically, but to be able to repurpose a courthouse and to be able to fund it, it's important to also have another income generator, such as new construction.
Thank you, Patty. We got a question here. Maybe Tom wants to address this one. Have we considered the market impact of non-residential uses in the Wilkins Rogers redevelopment, or the old flour mill or donut factory that's located on the Baltimore County side of the Patapsco River?
Thanks, Zach. Yeah, the kind of the closing of the mill and the redevelopment really happened right when we were wrapping up the master plan. So when the retail market study was done for Ellicott City Watershed Master Plan, the Wilkins Rogers Mill really wasn't into play at that time. So obviously any reuse of this would need to take those into consideration. It's a different dynamic because the mill is more connected to Main Street and at that level than this site, which is up on a hill and very separated from Main Street. So they are kind of different animals. But obviously, anyone looking at this site would take into consideration that look at all the uses in Ellicott City to be a complementary mix.
Thanks, Tom. We have a little bit more time for any other questions or comments. If you'd like to send them in. As Tom mentioned earlier, we will be emailing out a survey that will dive a little deeper into some of the ideas that we spoke to today, and as well as posting this presentation to the website that's on your screen.
Another question came in that I will take. This question was, does Howard County have any control over the mill in Baltimore County? So no, Howard County does not have any control over the mill in Baltimore County because it's in Baltimore County. But obviously, the two counties are partners, and given the proximity of the mill to Ellicott City, there is bound to be some level of coordination. So no to control, but likely yes to coordination.
So we received another question. The teams that expressed interest in the RFI, what kind of interest did they express and what kind of projects? So we talked to a few teams. There was a wide variety of interest, as I mentioned before. That will, that included potential consideration of the courthouse and the surrounding parcels collectively or independently. There was a number of discussions of different uses, which Tom touched on earlier in the presentation, as well. That would again be complementary to Main Street and the surrounding community. Looks like we got a question for Tom.
Yes, there's a question that if redevelopment occurs, do you envision changes to Rogers Avenue and Courthouse Drive? As I kind of glossed over it quickly, that the Bike Howard and Walk Howard plans do call for some changes to Courthouse Drive in terms of sidewalks and bike lanes. I believe a bike lane on one side and a sharrow on the other side. The other potential change could be that on the part of the courthouse property crosses over Courthouse Drive into the Patapsco Female Institute hillside, and there may be an opportunity to just shift that alignment a little bit to make more of a usable parcel on the upper lot. But that's the only and that's only over a very small section. But that and then the pedestrian and bike connection improvements would be the other improvements that would be envisioned. But connecting it to the Howard County complex would be an objective to consider.
Okay. Got a question here. Does the density of build areas and its economic yield need to be sufficient to offset the stormwater management and historic preservation goals? So, as we look at potential ways to redevelop this, I don't know that any of us are, we would suspect that answer will come out through the RFP process and the responses that we've received to the RFP. I mean, I do think it's important to note that there are a number of alternative funding sources that can be used for potential historic rehabilitation projects that may be able to be harnessed. So I don't know that we're able to answer that question directly, but it's something that would be flushed out through the potential RFP process. Next question we got was, will the bids or responses to the RFP be contingent on the zoning approval allowing new construction on site? So the potential for rezoning, we have as we mentioned earlier in the timeline, we have our hearing before the zoning board in September. We anticipate receiving a conclusion of the rezoning case before we would make our next steps in the potential RFP process. And so the zoning itself, the rezoning doesn't actually affect the new construction on site. It affects what the potential uses could be of that new construction.
If new construction happens, again, it's not a foregone conclusion.
Correct. So we received a question that if there are proceeds from selling the property, will those proceeds be used towards flood mitigation? So as part of this process, the county is exploring all potential ownership structures for these properties, and that may include the county maintaining a long-term interest in some or more of the properties. And so we are not sure what the disposition or potential disposition would be, nor what the potential for profit would be. Okay, we have time for just a couple more questions. So any other questions or comments, we welcome them in a couple minutes here, and we'll wrap up the meeting shortly thereafter. So we got a question if there is a timeline for the RFP. So the zoning board will meet on September 1st to hear our case for the map amendment for the change from HO to HC, or historic commercial. And so the zoning board does not have a prescribed time that they have to issue their decision. So once the zoning board issues their decision, then we'll determine the timeline for the next steps in the process, concurrent with that and with the public input that we've received from this meeting, the survey, and our other outreach efforts. Looks like we got a question for Nick. When will Preservation Maryland know if they receive the DHCD grant?
I expect we'll know in the next couple of months, so it shouldn't be a long time frame, hopefully.
Okay, we one question here. Have we reviewed time it's taken for a redevelopment of larger historic buildings and challenges, such as the old post office in Chicago or Jefferson Pilot in Greensboro, North Carolina? I haven't specifically reviewed those projects. I have been to the old post office myself, but we are well aware of challenges of historic buildings, as I think all of the interest that we received through the RFI process, the teams that we talked to in the RFI process were also all very interested, knowing the challenges that come with historic renovation and rehabilitation, mainly because of the unique opportunity that this project affords them to really have this generational opportunity to invest in this and provide uses that are complementary to our surroundings. Right. Any last questions or comments? Got time for one more if it comes. While we're waiting on that, I really appreciate all the attendees participating tonight. Certainly very robust attendance, which we greatly appreciate. Which I think the survey that will come out will really help us dial in our next steps in this process. So we'll go ahead and wrap it up there.
Great. Thank you, Zach. And just want to remind everyone that you could send in additional questions after this if you email them to EC Courthouse Project at howardcountymaryland.gov. Again, that's EC Courthouse Project at howardcountymaryland.gov.
Howard County MD. Yeah, Maryland's abbreviated.
MD.gov. Yes.
And that address will be posted to the project website as well.
And we'll have the survey will be up on the website sometime tomorrow, and open again through August 2nd. So thank you all for your participation tonight. We appreciate it.
Yep. Thanks everybody for participating, and especially Nick Redding from Preservation Maryland for their interest in helping us advance the former detention center as well. I really appreciate their partnership and attending tonight.